by Judge Dennis Davis, who probably needs no introduction to anyone, but is a tax judge, a labor judge, a competition law judge, and of course a member of the Tax Commission. And he will talk more specifically, I think, to legal and policy mechanisms to address inequality and the extent to which they may or might not work. We had asked Basami Baloyi from Oxfam to join us to talk about some of their work, but unfortunately for personal reasons, she had to withdraw at the last minute. So we just have two speakers, but that's absolutely fine. I'm reassured by all of my colleagues that there are many people here who can talk about policy. So we should have a really good and robust discussion once the two speakers have finished. I'm going to ask the speakers to speak for about 20 minutes. I will mute my video, but when I reappear and glare at you, it'll mean that you only have about 2 minutes to go and you should begin to wrap up. Otherwise, I'm going to ask everyone to mute their audio and their video while the speakers are speaking. And once that's done, we will have a full question and answer. Feel free, however, to use the chat whenever you like to record your comments or to ask questions, and we will find time to address them. So, Aroop, I think over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. I'm just going to share my screen, and I hope that everyone is able to see the presentation. Kathy, can you see the presentation?
Yes, it's all there. Thank you.
Okay,
yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to present here. So my goal here with the presentation is to really take a step back and give you the context by sharing with you our research results that estimate the distribution of household wealth in South Africa. As Kathy mentioned, this research was done with my co-authors Leo and Amory. So let me say upfront that any mistakes in the presentation are solely my responsibility. So before we jump into the research itself, let me just do a brief recap of why economists are interested in wealth inequality, or why maybe they should be more interested in wealth inequality. First, we know it's a stylized fact that wealth inequality is a lot more polarized than income inequality. Yet economists, really the analysis is dominated in the field of income and income inequality. Income inequality in itself, actually, if you look at the top end of the distribution, is quite heavily informed by incomes from non-labor market relations, so capital incomes that are based on wealth. And emerging research is showing that actually wealth rather than income is an effective determinant of access to other spheres that are seen as unequal. So education, healthcare, as I mentioned, labor markets. So really it's important to study wealth in and of itself to understand economic inequality more broadly. Then just in terms of the discipline of economics, there's at least two, if not more, channels of relevance. The first is in terms of households. So economists are always interested in household behavior and how that relates to consumption at the macro level. And wealth is a key component in determining household consumption, savings, investments. I think crucially, wealth is really important to understand where there are shocks, such as job losses, in understanding how households can smooth consumption. And in the context of the pandemic and lockdown, this has really been cruelly exposed. So I'll talk to that a bit later on when I discuss the results. In terms of economic growth, there's a lot of studies around how extreme concentration of wealth leads to political influence, how it can change credit and capital allocations, and how it's linked to further accumulation processes, how it affects productivity and public good provision. And then just as a final pointer that I think everyone is quite conscious of and aware of, but is worth pointing out here, and I haven't put it on the slide, given wealth is a stock of accumulations over time and it can be passed on and inherited, we also know that the higher starting level of wealth, the quicker you're able to build it up and accumulate it. We know, especially in South Africa, where the starting level of wealth has been configured by apartheid era dispossession and discrimination, that wealth inequality, as we see it now, really captures the historical legacy of injustice and inequality, and how how that discrimination and advantages now manifest into current inequality. So then, what we do in this paper, as a first step to understanding that broader picture, is we estimate the distribution of personal wealth, and we think this is really important step. Firstly, because we are creating a time series from '93, so we're trying to understand the evolution of wealth inequality. We also link it to the official household balance sheet statistics. These are statistics that are released by the Reserve Bank in a way that then is consistent with the economic activity that's recorded in South Africa. And we bring all available data sources that we think are relevant to answering this question. So then let me start off. Before the study, what do we know about wealth in South Africa? Well, thanks to the SARB, they have provided household balance sheet that gives us data from 1970 to current, to the present day. But this is a time series of aggregate wealth. I think, as I mentioned before, the national accounts that are estimated by the SARB, they record all the economic transactions. And as part of that, they provide estimates of the household balance sheet, so the aggregate wealth that's consistent with all economic activity that the SARB record in South Africa. How it's distributed, though, is less well known, and there have been studies that have aimed to understand this. A lot of those studies rely on survey data, which usually understates financial wealth. There have been other studies. McGrath in the 1980s used estate data to estimate wealth, and more recently, Orthofer has used tax data. We think we advanced some of these studies with more recent data releases and some different methodologies. As I mentioned, we don't know anything about the evolution of wealth inequality, so a lot of the estimates that a lot of the studies that I just mentioned are point estimates in time. We've tried to create a data series since '93. Most of the studies that have looked at evolution since '93 have focused on incomes. Just to add on to the point of why wealth is relevant, it includes these kind of key categories: housing, savings, revaluations, which are all key to policymaking. So just to give an outline of the rest of the presentation, first I'm going to briefly discuss what is wealth and what are the standard methods to measure it, before talking about the data sources that we use. And then the final section, hopefully saving the best till last, is to talk about our results and the distribution of household wealth in South Africa from 1993. Right, so the definition of wealth that we use is one that is informed by the United Nations systems of national accounts. These are standards that have been provided that are used internationally. So the Reserve Bank in South Africa use it, and the Reserve Banks in different countries use it, which ends up being quite an advantage, which I'll talk about in a bit. But broadly speaking, net national wealth is the market value of financial assets, the market value of non-financial assets, less your debts. So we're talking about property, business assets, agricultural land, bank accounts, cash. Then we're talking about pensions and life insurance, ownership of bonds and stocks. And then for debt, we're talking about mortgages, consumer credit, and other loans. We don't include durables. We don't include non-marketable notions of wealth. So we don't include natural capital. We don't include human capital. Then another way of thinking about net national wealth is for it to be divided between private wealth and public wealth. We're focused on private wealth. And for this, we define it as belonging to the household sector because of the nature of the accounting. Corporate wealth is reflected within the household sector wealth. So for instance, the wealth that's held through the JSE, that is reflected in the household sector through ownership of stocks. I'm going to very briefly skim through the three methods for time, but the way aggregate, once you have the measure of aggregate wealth, the next step is to allocate it according to the population. And there are three methods that are used when distributing this aggregate wealth. The first is through direct measurement, usually through surveys where you ask households or individuals directly what the market value of their wealth is. Another method is the estate multiplier. I think, as I mentioned, McGrath used this way back in the day. And this is quite an interesting one that we hope to develop our research to incorporate. But essentially it uses the deceased as a sample of the living. You look at estate duty records to get quite a detailed understanding of the assets within that estate. And then you blow it up through an inverse mortality multiplier to get an estimate of the assets of the living. The one that dominates currently is the income capitalization method. All assets generate flows. Flows are often easier to get access to. And then using rates of return, you can back out the asset base through which those flows have been generated. The data sources we use, so first just going to talk about the source of the Reserve Bank, the household balance sheets. The aggregate household wealth is divided into non-financial assets, financial assets, and debt. I think as you can see here, with financial assets, you don't get a specific targeted, sorry, let me start that sentence again. With financial assets, you don't get a specific disaggregation of assets. What you get is assets according to the institutions that they're held within. So assets with monetary institution, with funds and long-term insurers and other financial assets. So part of our work has been to tease out what proportion of assets are held within these institutions to get a breakdown. So this just graphs the data that comes from the Reserve Bank, and this is easily reproducible from the statistics that they release. This gives the composition of assets over time, and there's quite a clear graphic there about how the financialization of wealth has increased over time. So you see that the interest in pension funds and long-term insurers has increased over time, as well as the assets with monetary institutions. What you see in the blue sections is a decline in the importance of other non-financial assets. And those are things like business assets, ownership of equipment directly, agricultural land, and so on. This is, as I was mentioning, this is just a slide to inform what we've had to do in some of those categories. So land isn't specifically identified in the balance sheet, but we've used understanding from surveys to understand what proportion, say, of fixed assets, other fixed assets we can say is land and business assets, and then we've added that back into our decomposition. I think I'm not going to go through each one, but what's important to note is perhaps that we incorporate offshore wealth into our estimates, and we do that from taking information from other studies that show that offshore wealth in South Africa is equivalent to approximately 11 to 12% of GDP. So when we decompose wealth into these classifications of assets, there's there's quite a lot of information here. I think I just want to highlight, as with the chart below, that owner-occupied housing is still an important component of household wealth, 28.4%. Pension assets are important, and bonds and corporate shares together are also a big part of household wealth. So when we're looking at aggregates, we can see that approximately a third of wealth is non-financial and 2/3 of wealth is financial wealth. Approximately 30% housing, 35% pension, and 30% directly owned bond and stocks. So this slide is just to show all of the different sources of data that we use when we look to distribute that aggregate wealth. Essentially, what we're trying to do is to see what is the wealth in the surveys in relation to the aggregate in the balance sheet, and that helps us make any adjustments we need. So just to give you an example, from the NIDS data source, we see that owner-occupied housing is actually a lot more than what is represented in the SARB balance sheet. And so we do these sort of adjustments to make sure our estimates are consistent. A key addition in our study to previous studies is that we got access to tax microdata through a release or through a project that the National Treasury, SARS, and UNU Wider had together, which was to make tax data available for researchers. So we had access to mainly income tax data, which can be thought of in terms of the IRP5 data, which the employer submits on your behalf. And this really governs your wages, so your employment relationship, and it includes information about pensions, other contributions. And the ITR12 data, which is the self-assessment form that you have to submit, I think, in November. And this discloses information about your incomes from interest, so your IT3B, your rental income, specific forms of dividends, and other business income. So we had access to this panel, and that helped us to use this to estimate that top end of the distribution, to help us understand some of these income flows that just are usually underrepresented in survey information. I just wanted to highlight, in the context of our discussion, just highlight this information that actually comes from the Reserve Bank. So unit trusts are vehicles for collective investment schemes, but it's interesting to note how wealth interacts with legal mechanisms used to structure wealth. Professor Pistor talked about this in depth last time, and it would be great to have a discussion on this later on. Unit trusts I don't think are necessarily in the same category as other trusts that are used to shield wealth, such as inter vivos and testamentary. But I think it still gives a good picture of how the legal structures are heavily implicated in understanding wealth inequality. So, for instance, we see here that your corporate shares, over 50% are held through unit trusts, and the same with bonds, currency deposit bonds and loans. Okay, so just having briefly talked about the data sources and the methods, let's get to the results. I'm just going to skip this slide. This talks a bit more detail about the methods that we've used. We've actually used a mixed method where we've taken some information from the surveys through direct measurement. Some we've rescaled according to the National Accounts statistics. So we use the information to understand the distribution, but the actual quantification, we've made it in line to the national accounts. And then a mixed capitalization method, which is a combination of both the rescaling and the direct measurement and using flows to estimate the asset base. This just talks to the different methods that we've used for the different components of household wealth. But let me just go ahead to these results. So this is the table that presents the distribution of household wealth in South Africa in 2017. I think there are three aspects to this that I just want to highlight, but of course we can go into more depth. The first is if we compare the top decile, the top 10% to the bottom 90%, you see that the top decile owns the majority of the wealth, 85%, and the remainder is owned by the bottom 90%. That immediately shows the huge, or the extremities of the distribution right there. The next result I just want to highlight is the top 3,500 people. We estimate have the same share of wealth as the bottom 90%. So that's 3,500 people versus 32 million. Again, highlighting the huge concentration in household wealth. And then finally, as I alluded to in the introduction, I think a very concerning result is that bottom half of the population, 17.7 million, are on average net debt. Now, of course, debt is quite difficult to measure through the data sources, but at least what we can say is that the bottom 50% had debt or no positive net worth. And this is extremely concerning generally, but especially going into lockdown. Essentially, what this reveals is that half of the population didn't have the means to be able to smooth their consumption or really to survive when there was the economic lockdown and they had no access to incomes. And I think that reiterates the importance of some of these income support programs that have been discussed as a response to COVID. So this now takes the wealth group percentiles, so the asset groups, and shows which assets dominate, or which assets are held by these wealth groups. And if we look towards the bottom end of the distribution, we can see that currency notes and coins, as you'd expect, make up a very important part of the share of the assets. Then as we get into the middle of the distribution, we see the importance of owner-occupied housing and pension and retirement products more generally. And then what's interesting is from the 99th percentile onwards, you see the increasing significance of bonds and stocks, and almost when you get to 99.99, almost the complete domination of wealth held in bonds and stocks at that level. And now if we flip the perspective and we look at those categories to see how those categories are distributed, you see that in all the categories, even the ones that are important at the lower end of the distribution, it's dominated by the top decile. So, deposits and cash, 63% are owned by the top decile. Business assets, housing, 60, just under 60%. Pensions, 64%. And then, of course, what's interesting for bonds and stocks is even within the top decile, you have a huge concentration in the top 1%. And the top 0.01%. So, almost 2/3 of bonds and stocks is owned by the top 0.01%. So this just presents the results in terms of the age, and this is reassuring to us because it shows a consistency from the different data sources that we've used to create the evolution. And broadly, this is what you'd expect, that at younger ages, your wealth is lower and you build that up as you accumulate over time. I think what's interesting and what we'd like to research a bit more is what's happening towards the end of the, let's call it the end of the wealth cycle. The hypothesis about the lifetime cycle is that you should see a deaccumulation of wealth as people get older. We're seeing some deaccumulation, but actually it seems to be flattening out. And of course, that has implications as to what happens sort of intergenerationally. If we look at it from this perspective, this shows the distribution by age cohorts. This is quite a telling slide as well, because it shows that extreme concentration exists in all age cohorts, including the 20 to 39-year-old group. And this heavily implies what I was discussing right at the beginning in the introduction, that your starting levels of wealth are hugely important for the rest of your lifetime, but your starting levels of wealth are already quite unequal, and I think that has huge implications. If we look at the comparative perspectives, this is taking results from other studies that have been done, all the data that's available on the World Inequality Database. South Africa is higher than the others. What we also see is that across the time period that we estimate, the concentration of wealth has been relatively consistent for the top decile above 80%. We see here we see a bit of a decline going into 2004. This is in terms of shares of your aggregate wealth, and as we'll see later, this is actually informed not by anything happening in the top decile, but what's happening in the bottom 50%. The top 1% share is also pretty consistent over time, and actually increasing in the more recent years. And this is there's a bit more noise in this graph, but you see the top 0.1% share has actually increased. If we look at the bottom 50% share, what we see going into 2004 is a reduction in the debt of the bottom 50%. So just arithmetically, that means their share of net wealth has gone up, which means, as I was alluding to before, the share of the top decile went down, but this is really driven by the bottom 50%. And then we see in 2004, the debt increase, so your net wealth go down, and that is probably informed by the amendments to the Credit Act that allowed easier access to credit at the same time as seeing increased access to bonds and so on. So then just to conclude, I hope I'm within my time allocation, but just to conclude that the available data we have at the moment unanimously points to South Africa being one of the most unequal countries in the world, and especially when it comes to looking at wealth as opposed to income. We don't see any significant declines in wealth inequality since apartheid, and I think this picture is consistent despite the need for better data. Where could we use better data? Well, definitely at the bottom end, when looking at debt. Debt is notoriously difficult to measure, and we hope as we get access to different data sources, even from, say, the credit bureaus, that we can measure the bottom end a bit better. And then at the top end, of course, there's always room to get more information, especially when it comes to investigating wealth that are held through wealth shielding mechanisms such as trusts. With the tax data, there is tax mechanisms that should give us better access to information on dividends. The trust data, they also have to submit the ITR 12, it's called ITR 12T, estate duty. All of this information, if we can access a more complete database of this information, then that would help us improve our estimates. But I think it's just worth saying that we know that these data sources are concentrated at the top end. So the picture that we paint, broadly speaking, is unlikely to underestimate the concentration. Is unlikely to overestimate the concentration. It's more likely to underestimate the concentration. So we're likely to see more wealth held in that top 1%, top 0.1%. Okay, so I think that's it from me. So let me pass back to Kathy. Thanks.
Thanks, Aroop. Thanks very much. I think that it's a great grounding for the nature of the problem. So let me move straight on then to Judge Dennis Davis, who is our second and final speaker. Dennis, I will unmute you because I muted you.
Very good.
Sorry.
Let me just get my video. Okay. I should be able to. Where this won't go.
Okay, I think it was me that did it to you. There you go.
Yeah,
You should be able to
I think
now.
you have. Yeah, here we go. Hang on, there we go. Okay. Thank you very much. I want to perhaps start, if I may, where Aroop ended. Much of what he said, I completely agree with. There's no dispute between the two of us on that. But I think the only point I want to make in relation to his last point is actually we don't have half of that data. That's part of the problem. Part of the problem as to why we can't have a wealth tax, for example, is because actually we don't have accurate figures of people's wealth, neither legally nor illegally, if I may put it that way. There are vast sums of money which lurk overseas, which people have secreted out of the country, who still live here. We don't have that data. We have inadequate data in relation to wealth in South Africa. We could not implement a wealth tax tomorrow morning if we tried, because we simply don't have the data to do that, the actual patterns of what individuals have. That's inexcusable. And unfortunately, any steps that were taken in that regard, which there were completely and utterly eviscerated during the Moyane era. I cannot overestimate or emphasize the degradation and the of SARS during that period. All I can say to you is read the Nugent report in that regard, because you'll understand what the consequences are. It does mean a number of things. It means that our figures are all funny. They're not right. If you look at the tax figures, give or take, people reporting taxable income of over 5 million rand a year, they're just over 5,000 taxpayers. I know that Mr. Moyane used to get very irritated when I said that I knew more people at the Johannesburg bar who earned that than there were taxpayers. I suppose what I really meant was that if you added up what some of them earned and divided that by 5 and then worked out how much they were, since some of them would earn 10 times that, you probably get that figure. The point I'm simply making is the figure doesn't make any sense. Let me give you an illustration of what I mean. We know through SARS data, and this is imperfect, I might tell you, that South Africa is home to approximately 39,200 people with net assets of more than $1 million. So I'm talking about between 17 to 18 million rand. We know that we're home to 2,070 individuals with net assets of more than 10 million, and 94 we call centi-millionaires, that's with net assets of more than $100 million, and $5 billionaires. That's what we know. We don't know about many others, and there are others. So if you look at that and you look at so that means that many of these people, this massive cohort of 39,200 with assets of over 17 million rands, 18 million rands each at the time we calculated it, they are certainly not submitting, they seem to be not earning very much income, and if they are, presumably it may be shielded in all sorts of ways. So the reality is that again, Aroop is utterly correct, that his study shows the kind of Piketty effect, if you wish, that you start off with a lot of wealth and you continue in that particular regard. course, it is possible that you can start off with a huge amount of wealth and in fact end up with a small amount of wealth, but that doesn't mean, like Donald Trump, but that doesn't mean that you still aren't very wealthy. So the simple point I'm making is that our system is inadequate to deal with the problem. I'm not suggesting tax is the panacea to the problem, but it certainly can have some consequences. And one is trying one's best as we speak at the moment to put in place a dispensation which will allow for wealth to be calculated on a more individual basis. We get the kind of analysis information required to be able to implement something that would be meaningful, which I think is an important factor. It also does mean, in addition to which, that there is a vast cohort out there, probably way beyond our 39,200 that we're talking about, who have similar sums of money illegally either secreted out of the country or in the country. And that again is particularly interesting and quite disastrous for the country. It's interesting because it means that we are underestimating in all sorts of ways who's got what. It is disastrous because from a point of view of tax collection, I was on a call this afternoon with a whole group of people in an attempt to try to ensure that we can capacitate a unit to be able to deal precisely with these tax problems to which I've alluded. When I suggested that the tax gap, that is the amount that we should be collecting as opposed to what we are collecting, is definitely north of 100 billion, I was informed by many who know quite a bit, and rightly so, that I'm being very conservative in that estimate. So when you think about the fact that we've got a 300 billion shortfall, and we've probably we lose at least half of that every year, maybe more, through illicit activity, you can understand that there are a whole range of infrastructural problems which are absolutely disastrous to any attempt to right the economic ship of the country. That's apart from the reproduction of the levels of inequality. So the question is, to what extent, of course, the tax system can deal with that. And as I've said to you, it can only deal with it when it has, in a sense, two things going for it. One is a database which can be implemented, and two, a capacitated revenue service, which is able to actually deal with the problem in full. And I'm afraid on both those counts, we fall extremely short. It is also true, I suppose, that in some ways, and I say this from the time that I was on the Katz Commission of Inquiry back in the early 90s, that we really were at that stage, I think, very much prisoners of a particular perspective of the tax system. And I don't want to call it neoliberal, but it certainly was one which essentially said you keep rates as low as possible, have few incentives, and all will be well. And it really did very little to think about tax as an instrumentality to reduce forms of inequality. And what I find particularly interesting now, when I look at much of the proposals which are put forward in order to deal with the terrible problems that have been thrust upon us by COVID-19 in terms of revenue shortfalls, so many of the proposals actually hit the middle class. And I'm not suggesting that middle classes shouldn't actually bear more, but it is extraordinary the extent to which, when you start talking about taking away medical aid credits for people who are earning 300,000 rands and more, and a savings deduction of 600,000 rands and more, that these aren't these are not the same category as the $39,200 millionaires of which we know, apart from all the ones that we don't know. So we're going to have to rethink, in many ways, the whole design of our system to see to what extent, at least in part, tax can actually contribute. And I do think one of the things for me which has been inexcusable over the last 25 years is that there have been proposal after proposal put up for the purposes of a much better estate duty, which would essentially hit inheritances extremely hard. That would mean that and our proposals were essentially to shield middle-class people to some extent. It's just to say you'd have a rebate or an abatement, accurately put, to say certain amounts of money would not in fact attract a state duty, because for families who were not exactly all that wealthy, even if they might have been in comparison with South Africa, but ultimately where people really had significant estates, and there are many, actually to deal with it properly. And in fact, we've done very little about that for reasons which I find particularly interesting and we can talk about later. It is the same that very little effort was made, notwithstanding various attempts on the legislative side to plug the hole of trusts and other such legal instrumentalities. The fact of the matter is that we have so little information about them that they are gaping holes which in a sense perpetuate the kinds of wealth inequalities to which Aroop spoke earlier. But I think that if we are going to talk about inequality in law, Kathy, we need to go further and go back to what Katarina Pasteur was referring to. And that is to look at the very edifice of our legal system and the extent to which it does perpetuate startling levels of inequality. Let me give you 3 instances where I think the Pasteur argument, or let me put it more broadly, an argument that really reaches back to people such as Robert Hale, who hardly ever referred to in South African law schools. God forbid that they should be, because we must deal with Gracious and Foote and our Roman Dutch common law. We can't deal with people like Hale, who in a sense sought to actually interrogate the questions of concepts of law to see what effect it had on distribution of wealth. But Pasteur, who I think is as it were, an adapter of that very, very interesting tradition, what I think this is all telling us, apart from the way in which corporations and trusts are used and structured, and financial instruments are used and structured to shield wealth, both from attention and from taxation. If you simply look at areas of private law, there are very interesting issues here. So let me give you 3. There was a very, very lengthy and I think quite instructive report, which was chaired, the panel of which was chaired by somebody once upon a time who was at Wits, then at Cape Town, and is known to many people in the room, one of our finest of our academicians, which was Holton Cheadle, who chaired a panel which had been commissioned by the Competition Commission to look at the question of supermarkets and the whole way in which the supermarket industry, as it were, reproduce certain patterns, excluding small and medium-sized producers of food and other goods from the marketplace, and therefore, in a sense, reproducing patterns of inequality of a significant kind. And one of the most interesting things that they found was the way in which the law of lease is used so as to ensure that the large supermarkets can keep out of the malls and out of the shopping centers small and medium-sized firms who, to a considerable extent, therefore cannot get into the market because the supermarkets keep them out. And it's not just a question of bribing the landlords, etc. It's also a question of the way in which the ordinary common law of lease, as the report indicates, has a very significant effect on the way in which people have access to markets. And so that's just one aspect to flag, which seems to me particularly interesting and is hardly ever thought of, save in that context. We could go further in the competition field, and it'll be interesting to note the extent to which the ministerial amendments that took place in 2019, with particular view to the way in which the market should be open to new entrants, particularly from small black businesses, is going to have an effect. But obviously you do need to renovate the common law in that particular regard. The second area is the area of property law. And again, to cite another of South Africa's great academic lawyers, sadly, who's passed on. It's interesting that 2 of the the finest of my generation, probably the two finest of my generation, are both deceased. That's André van der Walt, who I'm referring to, and Etienne Murenic. Van der Walt, who wrote extensively about property law and pointed out, particularly in a very instructive article after the Modderklip case, the extent to which one has to look at property law in such a way that, in fact, it balances a whole range of rights and not just the question of ownership. And it seems to me, if Van der Walt's kind of injunctions in relation to what occurred after the Modderklip case, for those of you uninitiated in this particular regard, that's the case where there were 40,000 squatters on a farm, and whilst the police refused to evict 40,000, quite understandably, some judge who shall be remain nameless, who clearly knew less about social realities than police, basically granted an order of eviction until the matter went up to the Supreme Court of Appeal and to the Constitutional Court, where the argument was that there was, in fact, an obligation upon the state to provide these squatters with some level of housing, and that accordingly they couldn't just be turfed out, and that therefore there had to be a balancing of rights between them and the owner. So the owner was paid by the state a fair amount of money so that they could remain on the farm, trying to balance the two rights. And Van der Walt out of that extrapolates a whole series of principles of property law, which in a sense would totally renovate our conception thereof and would make access to land and to property without any legislative changes very, very much more nuanced, and again would be such as to fundamentally alter the sort of pattern of access to land of a kind, which again would have an effect on inequality. Let me give you a third example, and then the third example I have to give you is one which I have to have a full disclosure, because I was a judge at first instance. So I accept that I have a vested interest in this, but this is the most extraordinary case, which shows the depressing quality of what's coming out of Braamfontein, at least from the majority. So this was a case of a group of black workers or employees who finally were given franchise agreements from somebody whom they'd worked for. And the franchise agreements were twofold. The one was the actual agreement to sell the product, and the second one was essentially to sell the product from premises which had been owned by the franchisor. And it was for a 5-year period with an extension for another 5 years. And none of these people bothered to extend it formally in terms of a written agreement at the end of 5 years by way of exercise of their option. And so the landlord then, through a trust, which again goes to show the problems of using instruments a la the Pasteur argument, through the trust, they were all evicted. And that meant that they lost their businesses. And the matter went all the way to the Constitutional Court. And the substantive question was that here were people who were not really particularly literate business people. Most, if not all of them, had made indications that they wanted the leases to continue, but hadn't formally written to that effect. And I felt, and certainly the minority of the Constitutional Court, and obviously a much more elegant judgment than mine, and it's a judgment of Judge Froneman, signed on by Judge Madlanga and a separate one by Judge Victor, found, quite rightly it seemed to me, that this was the sort of case where you had to come to the aid of these business people, these small business people who otherwise would lose everything, and say, well, in effect, it wasn't just good enough to simply formally rely on the fact that you had to extend the lease by way of a written agreement, and that the Constitution in all sorts of ways, and in particular the fundamental normative framework thereof, was such to infuse into our common law a principle of acting in good faith, sufficient to say, no, you can't cancel the leases here. They've all actually evidenced an intention to extend them, and they shouldn't lose their businesses. Not so, said the majority of the Constitutional Court in a judgment written by Justice Theron, which essentially sort of makes all the right noises in relation to transformative constitutionalism and promptly basically shuts the door on these poor people, and they lost everything. Now, if you're going to adopt the law of contract in that way, particularly in a country like South Africa, where not everybody has got a degree in law nor a course in contract law, if you are going to actually show a level of astonishing social amnesia as to the reality of South African society and develop your law of contract on that, I, for one, am not surprised that we're going to sort of have a private law system which ultimately reproduces the levels of inequality which are evident in Aroop's presentation. So I want to end by saying that I don't, it's easy, it seems to me, very easy intellectually to talk about the fact that we could renovate our tax system if we had the right information, and that we could bring our tax system much more into alignment with the very, very interesting research which has been presented to us this afternoon. It may not be, when I say intellectually easy, it's practically difficult, because you've got to in fact capacitate SARS, and you've got to get the right information, and certainly certain people might have to go to jail, but that's not such a terrible thing in this particular connection if you got the tax laws right. But it does seem to me that back at the ranch, for we lawyers, there's that whole range of law, as Pasteur rightly says, that ultimately underpins the economic system, which in turn underpins the levels of inequality, which 26 years into our democracy seems still not to have been grasped sufficiently by neither the academy nor by the courts at large. And accordingly, it seems that if we are going to look at levels and patterns of inequality, we need to be tunneling from both sides. That is, both from, let's say, a public law, an institutional side, from a revenue side, but at the same time, looking at the way in which rights and obligations are created by our private law, inherited from a very different tradition, and seek to bring them into alignment with an enterprise that actually does address four square the questions of inequality. I could go on, but let me stop there.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Dennis. And actually, thank you very much just for summarizing, I think, one of the main priorities of this seminar series, which is, at least from a legal perspective, to get lawyers to think very much about that problem and not to see inequality just as something for human rights lawyers or public lawyers. And I can see some of my private law colleagues amongst the audience here today. So I think we can move on to questions and discussion. I don't have any questions in the chat box, but I do have Tubby Lioka's hand up. So I'm going to allow you, Tubby, to go first. And I think if other people could just indicate if and when they want to speak.
Thanks, Kathy. I've got a question for Judge Davies. So why don't we, because you're right that there is a problem at SARS, and it's not something that we can fix overnight. But there has been an interesting trend of, and we see it a lot with those who are either corrupt or stolen money. What they say they earn, their income is not congruent with their spending patterns. So why don't we create a system where if I earn 50,000 rands a month, I can't, and I walk to Porsche and I buy a car that costs 2 million rands cash, and I haven't inherited anything, I haven't received any other money, and I typically don't receive any other money except for my salary, and you have a history of this from the banks and also from SARS. Why doesn't the retailer flag that something's wrong, that someone who's earning 50,000 has, let's say, 100,000 savings, is suddenly buying a car that costs 200 million cash, and then buys a house that costs 13 million cash, and then I go and then my card also has all these huge monies that come out, and yet it doesn't really, is not congruent with my income. And you see that quite a lot, and you read about it. You can look at the VBS guys or any of their corrupt guys that have been mentioned in many of state capture or even the PIC, that their spending and income is incongruent, and surely there should be a system that flags you when you spend over and above what you receive. That's the first question. The second question is, to what extent, so there is a trend, I was on the PIC Commission of Inquiry, and there is a trend of monies that go into lawyers' trust accounts. And how does SARS have an eye into that money? And also, there is a lot of money laundering using property companies. Is SARS aware of that, and how does one trace that? Because it also seems to be that there's a third party that has the funds and then keeps funneling them into an account every time, and that allows that person to then purchase these big items.
I don't know, do you want me to?
Dennis, yeah, Imran has his hand up, so I wonder if we shouldn't take Imran's question, then maybe.
Sure, I can shut up and then I'll take any questions. Obviously, there'll be ones for it as well, but for me, I'll take them when you want me to.
Okay, so maybe Imran, if you go ahead, and then if there's no one else after that, then Dennis and Aroop can answer.
So I had three thoughts. The first two are for kind of essentially for Aroop, and then the third one's for Dennis. So I mean, I think Aroop's done a kind of fantastic job to paint a kind of picture of what the patterns of kind of inequality in wealth look like in South Africa. I think the next kind of question is what are the underlying factors that are driving that pattern, and what should we do about changing it? So we could take the approach of saying that sort of all of this concentration at the top is kind of stopping the economy from growing, or you could take an alternative view, which would say that the pattern looks as bad as it does because the nature of our society is that we've got all of these earners at the top, and that we've got this huge bulge at the bottom, and that the kind of essence of the problem is that you don't have a kind of serious middle class, and in kind of any other society, all of us who are on this call would be in the middle classes. I kind of hate to tell you all that you're in the top decile of kind of Aroop's distribution. So maybe the problem isn't with the top, but with the missing middle, and the sort of economic strategies that you should be following, depending on what your view is on what's driving that pattern, might be quite different. So I'd like to hear Aroop's thoughts on that. The second one to Aroop is, sort of in the end, it doesn't matter so much whether you go for the wealth or you go for the income. Right? The kind of income is a flow that comes out of that wealth, and from a tax point of view, in the end, if you getting to that money somehow, then you're doing fine. And maybe it's easier to do it from the income side than from the wealth side. And I'd like your views on that. The third one to Dennis, and maybe to kind of suggest that Dennis is, I'm being a bit provocative, because I think you have to be provocative to Dennis. Maybe you're still in the trap of the Cats Commission, in the early 90s, Dennis. I mean, if we're not going to do something about this problem now, then when are we going to do something about it? So I completely agree with you that we have to think about SARS capacity. I completely agree with you that you have to have the information systems kind of in place, but Praveen didn't fix up SARS by sort of not doing anything. He locked up the CEO of Orlando Pirates. He went for some of the big business guys. He completely changed tax morality, not by kind of only doing the building inside SARS, but by kind of going for some of the kind of high profile folk who were not paying their taxes. And he simultaneously did that with building the institution. If we're not going to use COVID to start to address this problem, then I think maybe we're missing a huge opportunity. And maybe Dennis is being a little too conservative about this.
Oh, conservative. Thank you, Imran. I'm going to take one last question from Kiasha, and then we'll go to Aroop and Dennis to respond. Kiasha, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you, Kathy. I like the last part of what Imran said. I think we should jump at the opportunity that COVID has presented us with. Having said that, I also really enjoyed Aroop's information and his presentation. I think for me, there's just a few comments that I would like to make. The first one is, Aroop, you made a comment on the end of life, that at end of life, the life cycle, there's actually a deaccumulation of wealth. I'm not sure I agree with that so much. And then in terms of the stats, it was good to see the wealth, when you looked at all these graphs. What would be very interesting to see, and I think what's equally important when we look at this concept of wealth and inequality, is to balance that against things like information from Stats SA and National Treasury that look at things like household spend and look at the so-called middle class, to look at all the variables when we look at this concept of wealth. And then lastly, the comment on tax, from information that we get from SARS, as Mr. Davis pointed out, some of it we can get, some of it we never will. Like, for example, there was a VDP program that SARS had at some stage, which, there's a lot of information there, but there's some things we cannot get. So I think to conclude, what I'd like to just say is this is a very big cake that I'm sure if we start cutting it up, we'll make some headway. And yeah, thank you. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Kiasha. I think, can we take the responses in the order of speaking? So Aroop, do you want to go first? And then Dennis, you can go on.
Sure. Okay, yeah, well, thanks very much for the questions and comments. Perhaps if I just start at Kiasha's questions first. So my comment about the life cycle. So yes, you're absolutely correct in what you're saying. And perhaps it was more that I wasn't clear in what I was saying. The life cycle hypothesis is just an economic theory that is meant to state that you're supposed to get deaccumulation towards the end, and I was applying that to the chart that I showed to say that actually this doesn't seem to be the case. So I'm in complete agreement with you. It seems to flatten out when we're looking at the sort of the 60s and 70s rather than go downwards. And for me, I just wanted to highlight that finding to say that actually I don't think the deaccumulation is taking place, at least in South Africa, and that points to perhaps a different, that we need to think about whether the life cycle hypothesis applies to the wealth inequality story at all. The stats in comparing it to household spending and other things that are released from Stats SA, I think we need to combine all these different elements of inequality together to get an overall picture of economic inequality. I think this was a specific exercise using a specific definition of what assets are. And yeah, I'd be interested in chatting with you a bit more about how you think household spend could relate to getting a better understanding of assets, asset wealth. And I guess that also relates to the first kind of set of comments about how how if consumption seems to exceed what a household has in terms of both incomes and assets, and that's a clear flag of something going wrong. The info from SARS, I don't think that's a specific comment towards my presentation, but perhaps just a general comment. I mean, I'd just like to point out that that there are mechanisms that are in play in SARS, and I completely agree with all the sentiments about capacity and implementation. But I think these are things that would certainly need to be supported in perhaps this new political environment. SARS have a third-party data platform and a direct data channel that comes from financial institutions. What the state of that is, that's for sort of SARS people to talk about, and perhaps Justice Davis knows. But in a way, that the technical platforms are there, and perhaps just with both political and budgetary and capacity support, that could be transformed into something that can help SARS deal with some of these information gaps. But then, just moving on to Imran's set of comments. I mean, these are definitely broader questions that our research at the moment doesn't delve into, and we're hoping that it will. I think what's interesting in this sort of research is that first we were able to isolate what the categories of domination within these assets are, and then from that we can then drill into understanding what the processes are that lead to say, the missing middle, not having ownership of these. The pension funds were designed partly to incorporate a broader access to the stocks and bonds, and so what we've done is, because we've separated out direct ownership of stocks and bonds to pensions, we were hoping to see a broader distribution or a broader ownership amongst the pension classification of assets. And actually we see that it's really not the case. It's still the top decile that's owning that. That to me speaks to something a lot broader in the economic structure of South Africa, including and perhaps almost extremely significantly pointing to the problem of the labor market. So, you have this huge kind of dualistic structure of the labor market, dualistic structure of ownership that and entry into ownership structures. And then, as Justice Davis was talking about, you have problems that are facing SMEs that aren't just about seed funding and, funding entrepreneurs that really are perhaps in the survivalist sector rather than the entrepreneurial sector. So I think a lot more research needs to be done on digging out what's driving this concentration of ownership. But I wouldn't necessarily take it away from, I wouldn't necessarily move the focus away from the top, because especially when we're looking at inequality, we're looking at the relationships between the different sectors of society. And so, for instance, you know, the elite can influence legal and political decisions that reproduce the policies that, you know, ensure their dominance in terms of ownership. And then with tax, you know, whether we focus on incomes or wealth, I mean, I think this is quite a big debate. And I think there is a challenge in only focusing on incomes. And being high on the income distribution doesn't necessarily mean that you are, in a broader sense, rich enough to continuously have your income taxed at higher and higher levels. So for example, if you think of the discussion around the black tax, there are people who are, you know, high up on their income distribution who end up informally redistributing a lot of that income to support perhaps maybe what the government should be doing in terms of redistribution, but, you know, ultimately form a channel of informal redistribution. Secondly, income is far more precarious because you can get fired or have an economic shock. And then, for instance, in lockdown, you know, what is important to keep the economy running is to continue the flows that different businesses have, that consumers have, that workers have. So I think there's an important conceptual difference about targeting incomes versus wealth. But obviously, a lot of the debate, you know, as has been discussed before, is around the capacity and the implementability of a tax on wealth. And I think that's perhaps a discussion that we can have in more depth. But certainly, I think there is an important conceptual difference in not just focusing on incomes. Okay, but let me leave it there for now, and then we can continue if there's a follow-up.
Thanks, Aroop. Dennis.
Yeah, so let me start off with the first question. You know, it's an interesting. There's a story which is told in SCIS. It's told to me, which I know is true, about an old auditor who was a SCIS member whom they referred to as Mr. Chips. And one day, Mr. Chips was sitting and having his coffee and reading his morning newspaper when he came across a photograph of somebody with a very fancy Ferrari. It's a true story. And Mr. Chips looked at this and said, the Ferrari must be worth 3, 4, 5 million. I wonder how much income this man has. And Mr. Chips went and found the file of the individual. And lo and behold, he was reflecting 60,000 rands a year. So Mr. Chips then phoned him up and said he was curious as to how the man could actually afford a Ferrari and 60,000 rands of taxable income a year. To cut a long story short, man said, well, his mother gave it to him. Then, of course, when the inquiries turned out, his mother was a very, very impoverished pensioner. And to cut a long story short, after all that's got through, the man sat across the road from the Commissioner of Inland Revenue and wrote out a check for R500 million of taxes. Now, the point of the story is that it's one thing using retailers to do that. That I'm not sure is viable. But, and this partly goes to Imran's point, that in fact, Imran, and so I'm combining the two, if I may, the real route here is how do you actually kind of replicate many Mr. Chipses so that you can actually start finding exactly who's got what, because the point made by W. Singh is absolutely correct. There are legendary cases of that kind. And, you know, I was, it's not my idea. In fact, my co-author, Michelle Aroop, said to me, why don't you people have a specialized unit? And I went off to Kisveta and said to him, you know, it's interesting. What about looking for a specialized unit that we can capacitate And I've just come off a call with Business South Africa because I've reached out to them and to others to try to see whether we can't find retired forensic accountants, bankers, and tax experts to capacitate with SCIS a unit which would essentially represent Mr. Trips. And what I mean by that is a unit which is going to go around and do a whole range of things, including you know, going down the Lani parts of Sandton and Camps Bay and Bishop's Court and the other fancy suburbs of the country, and saying, well, that's a 50 million rand house. Let's have a look at what that person's actually reflecting as their income. And I can tell you now that if we start doing that, we are going to find huge gaps in our system. So the answer is, it's not that we're sitting on our backside and doing nothing or captive of the old paradigm of the Katz Commission. In fact, to the contrary, this is happening as we speak. And that would also include a range of other issues which equally become important. The question of looking at corporations who are using transfer pricing for quite considerable leakages. All of those people who have vast sums of money overseas, but live in South Africa and have never disclosed it. Mention was made of the VDP, the Voluntary Disclosure Program. Absolutely right. We expected, on the basis of what had happened in Argentina and Indonesia, to collect about 20 billion. At the time, we collected 4. Well, I'll tell you why we collected 4. 2 reasons. One is because it was done during the Moyani period, and 2, because the levels of tax legitimacy are so poor that people just were saying to me, our clients aren't prepared to pay, given the levels of corruption in the country. So, you know, that's not an acceptable, it's not good enough, but what I'm trying to say is, dead right. And the only way you can curb those problems is by an aggressive campaign, a holistic campaign, which essentially seeks to actually deal properly with the huge hemorrhaging that's taking place. And so, Imran, in answer to your question, which goes to the second question, yes, we are now actually doing it. Now, it's not the retailers I'm particularly worried about. I'll tell you what I am worried about are the banks. Just think about it. How did the Guptas actually manage to get all that money out of the country? They got it through the banking system. And why and where were the failures in the banking system, right, which allowed this to occur? Now, what I have found very interesting, and I'm not going to mention the bank, one of the very large banks has reached out to me and now to my team with SCIS and are working with us because they are so disturbed by the levels of fraud in the VAT area, to the extent that we think, even in relation to their accounts, we're talking about anything up of 20 billion rand over 3 years. Just one bank. Now we are now reaching out to every single other bank, and we're going to insist on their 100% cooperation, because frankly, they are a portal into particularly the problem that you're talking about. So let me say, I agree entirely that we've got to rethink SCIS. That's precisely what we're doing. But I cannot tell you the damage that was done over the period under Moyani and as documented by Bob Nugent in his commission. So that's the first point I wanted to address. I also think that I agree entirely that we should be looking at wealth and not just income. There is a difference because you can get very, very wealthy people whose incomes, perhaps because of dividend taxes and because of various other tax incentives, which we also have to look at, probably pay less than they should. And that is another factor which one needs to inquire into. But again, I must stress that going back to Imran's point, that I don't think it's a conservative point, Imran. I'm happy if you're going to call me that, but it's not a conservative point to say, you know, we inherited a situation whereby literally you've got to reconstitute the entire information gathering process in order to do that. Now, where you are right is that information gathering process could have been done years ago and wasn't. So that is in relation to wealth. People are supposed to return assets and liabilities. It's been dealt with on a very cavalier basis. So I want to suggest that watch this space. That is something which I think over the next year, there's going to be determined efforts to alter. And I'm reasonably confident that we play our cards correctly here. You know, the tax gap will be far less than the 300 billion, well, not necessarily for this year, but as we go forward. I just want to make one other point, if I may, Kathy, which is to do with the issue of pension funds and the like. It's interesting. Before 1994, there was a very interesting debate that took place about the governance of pension funds and who should be on the pension fund board, who should be on the boards of companies where pension funds had significant of shares. And the idea was, in a sense, to think through a totally different form of corporate governance, rather than having professional trustees on it. What about worker representatives and so on and so forth, which would in fact change the entire trajectory of the way companies might think about their policies. And in a sense, if you wish, try to bring our corporate law, much of law, rather than the model. And so we need to think that through very carefully. And then my final point is, we've done very little in relation, the missing middle. It goes back to this question of how much work have we done to promote small businesses and entry of small businesses into the market, particularly from historically disadvantaged communities that happen to be presently disadvantaged. So that again requires a total re-audit of all our law, including our corporate law and our private law. And I don't want to leave this room without emphasizing just how critical that all is.
Thank you, Dennis. I can see two more hands. I can see Michael Sachs and Ghulam Abubakar. Michael, do you want to go first?
Okay, I hope my connection is stable.
Yep.
I wanted to say, I think where I agree with Dennis Davis is that we shouldn't think of wealth tax as being a magic button that can be pressed to solve all of our problems in a year or 2 years. I think when Piketty in his first book, or his first it start off at quite a low level, and the purpose behind it was to gather information, exactly in the sense that Dennis Davis is talking about, that once you have a tax in place, I mean, it's all very well saying we must start gathering the information, but there's nothing that will motivate you better about gathering the information than having some tax that you've got to collect. So I think what Dennis Davis is describing, which we really need to move towards, a lot of the issues around SARS were around the large business unit and how effective the large business unit was, in particular in raising effective rates of taxation on the finance sector, on the banks. Now, what we need is a high net worth individuals unit within SARS that begins to ask, and I don't think the right way to think about it is walking down streets in Sandton and seeing who's driving Ferraris. The right way to think about it is to take those 3,500 individuals that apparently come up in Aroop's work and say, who are they? Where are they? How much income tax, never mind a wealth tax, how much income tax are they paying? Where are they, how are they structured? Where is their tax residence? Are they making a fair contribution to the fiscus? And probably if we start doing that, the first problem we're going to come up against is that the elite wealthy of South Africa are not South Africans in a tax sense. And I want to, and this is a question for Dennis, that in the 90s, we all know and we all talk about how
Michael, you disappeared.
oh, I'm sorry.
No,
very little is, very little is said about the changing basis of taxation from residence to source. and how this may, so are those, I wonder whether those 3,500 individuals that Aroop has turned out are actually South Africans in a tax sense, or have they seen the wind and restructured their affairs so that they're actually not resident in taxpayers of South Africa? So those are a bunch of questions for Judge Davis. For Aroop, or not so much for Aroop, but as a comment, I think that what is clear, actually, what comes out from this work very clearly, is the precarious nature of the wealth of the top 1%. As Aroop shows, it's all in stocks and bonds. If, as many of us think is likely, government defaults against its debt obligations in the next 3 to 5 years, all of that wealth is going to evaporate. And as government defaults on its debt obligations, it's going to also take down the stock market. So if you look at the time series of the wealth of the top 1%, it very accurately follows the vicissitudes of stock market capitalization. What is driving stock market capitalization? Well, it's extraordinary monetary policy in the United States and the European Union, shifting funds into South Africa, inflating our stock market. That's what's doing it now. What did it from 2004 to 2008 was the commodity boom. So as commodity prices rise, form of wealth which can easily evaporate, and it's likely in the next 3 to 5 years that that type of wealth will evaporate in South Africa. So we have to ask, if we're going to redistribute wealth, can it be done in a way that doesn't destroy wealth? Lastly, on the middle class, I think the debate we really need to have there is about housing. Government has built millions of housing units over the last 25 years, but I doubt very much that any of it shows up in Aroop's work because there are no title deeds. These things are not valued on any register. And they have tended to be low value. People are forced to hold these assets for 8 years before they can sell them. So what we really need to discuss is middle class home ownership and the real middle class, the low income middle class. How do we begin to create markets that allow people to accumulate housing assets? Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. I just have one more hand raised, which is Gulam. Gulam, if you'll go ahead now, and then we'll take the final answers from both Aroop and Dennis and wrap up.
Thanks, Kathy. Hello to Judge Dennis and to Aroop. The question that I have is that we have a very short time before the country would explode. Already we saw levels of inequalities and poverty deteriorating quite rapidly as a result of COVID and the unemployment in its kind of path. Now, in a sense, I was quite interested in Aroop's paper, which talks about what kind of revenue a tax on wealth could create. So, for me, the issues are quite urgent. How soon can we get a database that details the amount of wealth that the 3,500 or the 39,000 that Dennis was referring to? At the moment, he's right. We do have a fair amount of goodwill between the business organizations, government, and labor. So now is a good time to have a social contract, and an element of that could be a tax on wealth. I don't see, if we survive the next 2 or 3 years, then I feel a bit more optimistic about whether South Africa would default on its debt. But the key issues are, how do you tackle poverty currently? By how long would it take to set up a kind of database? And what kind of capacity you require in SARS to be able to institute a wealth tax to, for example, fund something like the basic income grant, around which there seems to be a lot more consensus now than when it was initially proposed by the Taylor Committee. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Gulam. Okay, so let's take Aroop for his last comments. And Aroop, you have a question. I'm not sure you have a question for Dennis. So Aroop, you go ahead, and then Dennis, you can wrap up.
Yeah, thanks. So no, it was more just a comment that I had in response to in response to the foreign ownership of wealth, just in terms of my study. So because we use the SARS tax data for, especially for the top end of the distribution, those top 3,500 people would be tax residents in South Africa. So I just wanted to just clarify that element. But of course, foreign ownership is an important component of wealth holdings. I'm not sure if there's anything else specifically for me to comment on. I think the wealth tax comment and debate is quite a large one. I just, perhaps in this regard, you know, of course I agree with a lot of what's been said about implementation and not having a sort of audited wealth database that would help or be crucial to sort of tax revenue collection. I think an interesting counterexample, we always hear about examples of failure of a wealth tax. I think an interesting example that's worth considering and that hopefully you know, we'll try to bring out in the discussion a bit later on is that of Colombia. Colombia have a long history of both successful and unsuccessful wealth taxes. But where it's been successful, it has come from a similar base where it's just been implemented, I think in 2002, but post a very understaffed and under-resourced tax administration. And key to what they were able to do is obviously the political economy underlying the implementation of a tax. What was key to that was the proposal of using the tax to deal with a crisis, and that got, you know, ultimately taxation is successful when there's consensus and when, you know, there's almost an interest of the wealthy to almost a self-interest of the wealthy to pay the tax to fund what is specifically earmarked for that tax revenue. In the case of Colombia, it was security to fight the internal security problems, as well as the drug gangs, which was seen as threatening the interests of the wealthy and the economy. So I think that would be an interesting discussion to have. Under what circumstances would the wealthy in South Africa be willing to contribute, you know, in the case of a wealth tax? And you know, you hope that actually a crisis that we're currently facing would be, you know, a key motivator in that respect. You know, but let me just round up by saying that, you know, I think this discussion is a really important one, not just the wealth tax, but wealth inequality as a structural inequality and a central pillar of economic inequality, and the legal underpinnings that can, you know, that can hopefully be changed to change the distribution and the outcomes that result from things like property rights. There's of course other economic phenomenon as well that we need to look at. So, you know, I alluded earlier to this focus on SMEs and entrepreneurship and looking at startups. We've seen, you know, when you look at a lot of the government policies directed towards SMEs, you know, you see a lot of direction of those funds, perhaps at the wrong end, or at the wrong point in the SME sort of chain of development. So you know, you can look at a lot of the efficacy of policies as well in trying to understand where that building of the middle class could be in terms of wealth accumulation. I think, you know, underpinning all of this is that we need to just do a lot more research around wealth and around assets, and build up data systems, build up policy evaluations, and basically build up a broader information base to understand how to address wealth inequality. And let me leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Aroop. Dennis, do you want to?
Michael, I agree with a lot of what you said. Interestingly enough, you did, sorry, the 39,020 people that we've got are actually South African taxpayers. So the ones that I said were more than $1 billion, $1 million and more. It is true that there are many who aren't, and it is true that whether we should have moved from a source-based to a residence-based tax system is a very interesting question. And there are many countries that have thought, given the digital economy, that in fact in e-commerce that we should have not done that, but that's neither here nor there, I suppose, at this point. But you know, the 39,000 are South Africans, and I think you're right about the question. The problem with wealth taxes, of course, is the shifting nature of wealth. You know, there's no doubt that we're going to find probably a reduction in capital gains tax revenue simply because of the stock market not being quite what it was. So one has to be cautious about the extent to which wealth taxes actually are a panacea. And the Colombian example is a successful one, but it's a very low rate, I add. It's not a huge rate. And one of the advantages about a wealth tax of that kind backs up the point that Michael has made, that if you have a wealth tax, it gives you better information, and that also gives you better information in relation to income tax. So you get a double sort of advantage coming out of the two. But I do think it's terribly prudent not to run away with the idea that if we implemented a wealth tax, suddenly our tax problems would go away. They wouldn't, insofar as our tax system is concerned. I wasn't suggesting for one moment that the idea of a significant unit, seriously capacitated, with 30, 40, 50 people, would be running around in the various suburbs looking for housing. I'm merely suggesting that it wouldn't be a bad idea to do a little bit of that, because one of the things about getting a proper tax regime, revenue administration, is the deterrent effect. If, for example, you just took 5 or 6 of your 50 people and asked them to do that, I can assure you that if one particular person is audited in a suburb, the word gets around to everybody, and they'll all be rushing off to their tax accountants and coming to do voluntary disclosure programs, because they suddenly would not be getting away with it. The commissioner tells a wonderful story about at one point when they were trying to give a super duper service to very wealthy people, and they wrote letters to extremely wealthy people to say that if you, for example, do the following, you get a sort of a platinum card service from revenue. And he said quite often he'd go to parties and people say, I haven't got my letter yet, because it became like a snob value to get one. And so I do think that the deterrent effect would be important, but the focus, the central focus would be on the 39,020. It would be on the Panama Papers. It would be on the VAT fraud. It would be on taking, for example, the Abu Ghani and other reportages and saying, let's do lifestyle audits on all these people. You know, I'm listening at the moment to some of the evidence in the Zondo Commission, and I scratch my head. I say, well, we certainly know quite soon whether Mr. Greasy or Mokonyane is telling, Mrs. Mokonyane are telling the truth. Let's do a lifestyle audit, for goodness sake. Do a comprehensive audit on everything to do with that. We'll soon find out whether, in fact, he or she is telling the truth. What are we faffing around for? And what I'm trying to say is there are a whole range of comprehensive techniques that we have to take. And I think the problem about it is when Imran talks about the missing middle, the truth is, Imran, that people at low levels, because of the VAT payments that they make, and to some extent PAYE, are paying a serious sum of money into the revenue service. And look around and think of all these people who are driving their Ferraris with impunity. And so that's why I think it's a multi-pronged strategy to reconstruct revenue. And certainly, Michael, the focus would be on trying to measure the gap between the so-called reported millionaires, dollar millionaires, and the tax that they pay. And if we could get round to even 10% of that 39,020, I think you'd see remarkable changes in tax compliance. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Aroop. I think we will wrap it up there. It's been a wonderful, complex and rich discussion. I'm not sure we've found many answers. We found lots of questions. I do hope that it's a discussion that will continue through the next seminar series. We have planned for August a seminar on indebtedness. So hopefully all of you will join us then and we will continue the discussion. But in the meanwhile, thank you again, Dennis and Aroop. You made it a really wonderful webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks very much. Thanks.
Cheers.